Great. So I'm just going to introduce the project, and then Mark's going to provide a lot more details about the actual intervention. So for those of you who don't know Mark, he's at the University of California at Santa Barbara. He works generally on issues of governance and environment. Really fantastic scholar and a good man, and I'm glad to work with him. I'm Brigham Daniels. I work at BYU Law School. Mark and I met during graduate school on the PhD program. So this project really, just to kind of lay out sort of our theoretical goals here, we see a lot of calls in the literature for community directed development. At the same time, there is a call for much more interventions and randomized control trials, this sort of thing. It's actually pretty hard to have a randomized control trial when you deal with community-directed development because you need the cooperation of the government very often to do this. And when you think about places where institutions are poor or weak, it's often hard to get their consent. We've been able to pull off one of these, or at least we're starting in the front edges of this. And the hope is to bring community-directed development and informational interventions together. So here's, let me just give you a little background of the project. There's a map of Uganda. We're interested in this little area down here. It's called Bwindi National Park, and we've been working in the communities surrounding Bwindi National Park. Uganda generally is a place where there's a lot of poverty, large pockets of particularly in rural areas, a lot of challenges that have been sort of echoed here for the in various presentations. There's been an effort to decentralize Uganda government, and among many funding organizations, there's further attempts to decentralize, and a lot of attention paid to community development. This is a picture of the park, or a GIS overlay, I guess, of the park where we're working. And these are the various villages around the park where we've been working. So there are 98 what they call frontline villages. These are the villages that are closest to the park. The reason that this is relevant is that if you're a frontline village, you're eligible for a portion of the gate fee when people come into the park. They're basically on an annual basis about $1,300 goes. $1,300 goes to these various villages. They can go. They're used for a variety of things. Just to give you scale, $300 is the average income, so $1,300. That's for a family of 7. $1,300 is quite a bit of money for these folks. It can be used almost without any string. Very often it's used to buy animals, animal husbandry, but other things can be purchased. Roads have been an example of things purchased in the past. In talking to people in the villages, we found very early on that many people report not getting any benefit from this program. Other people reported that they see the benefits in their village, but they have been excluded. So this is a picture of Bwindi National Park, or at least on the outside, at the outskirts of it. And what you can see is that it's a place where subsistence farming and pretty dense forests exist side by side, and literally you can see the border of the park. I mean, literally side by side is the way that it works. As I've already mentioned before, the people there are quite poor. The roads are in very, very poor condition. There's very little in the way of public infrastructure. It's very difficult to get around. This isn't a very large place, but many of these villages are still a 3 or 4 hour drive from, and maybe a 2 or 3 hour hike afterwards. So they're really quite remote, a lot of them. The way that the park generally has protected its borders is through the use of armed guards. And because of that, there's a lot of conflict between locals and the park. And the park is really hoping to improve its relationship with the people, and they see this revenue sharing is a really vital tool to kind of put those two things together. Yeah, it's a very strange place because although poverty is very apparent in many places, so is great affluence. And this is a lodge in Bahoma, which is a little town near the park. Tourists come in, spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on their stay. They spend $600 to get a permit to track gorillas. And this is existing side by side with the poor locals. But the one thing that is really clear is there's this. If you kind of think about is there enough sort of gravy here for the rich people who are enjoying the park to compensate the poor people who might be excluded from the park? There's clearly enough resources here, and the question is whether or not we can figure out a way to get these resources so the winners somehow can compensate the losers. This idea, this bargain it looks good on paper or maybe in concept, but in reality it's a pretty hard sell. We have a wide range of problems that you face, whether it deals with issues of people feeling excluded, whether these are problems that are often found in community-directed development. And what you see in the literature, great calls to overcome a lot of these problems in community-directed development. One of the challenges that you have is oftentimes the funding organizations don't have interaction with all of the people, even though they might have a lot of interaction with local leaders who don't feel excluded at all. The one question that we have here is whether or not cell phone technology can change any of this. Mobile technologies, like in many other places in the developing world, have exploded as of late. And the question is, can these technologies help overcome any of these challenges? Particularly whether there's a way to engage with people in a way that's more targeted. And maybe I should even say more targeted. In many instances, the park has not really engaged with these folks at all. As we've gone around in the villages, people have very little contact with the park. They also have very little contact with people wanting to send them cell phone messages. So people were really quite excited when they heard about our research. This is just a small sample of the kinds of messages that we've sent. I don't know if you can read it, but the top one here, if managed correctly, 95% of your village's total revenue funds should be delivered to your subcounty chief, name such and such in a subcounty chief's name. Here's what we basically tried to do is provide specific opportunities for people to participate in their program and to provide accountability of local leaders. The hope was to increase participation, efficacy, perceived knowledge of the folks receiving these messages. Some of these do that better than others, but that's been the underlying goal. Now, the literature suggests that there's a number of reasons why an information treatment would actually work. The theory sounds pretty good. Information increases participation. Information is necessary for participation. It empowers people. It facilitates monitoring. It promotes equitable choices. On the other hand, there's some reasons why it might not work. And we've seen a lot of this, particularly in the voting literature. Information isn't necessarily the fundamental constraint. There's a range of things up here. I'm not going to read them all off, but one way or another, that the information might not be credible or somehow demobilizing. Okay. I'm going to turn this over to you, Mark, and have you talk about the rest.
Sure, and just to come back to Leonard's great keynote today, I mean, the goal here was that we're not providing information about the quality of services here. We're providing information about the rights that people have to participate in community-driven development. So what we're trying to do is increase people's efficacy to participate in a process that already exists without changing the process itself, is a good way to characterize this. So we have 98 villages, we have random assignment of these 60 messages that went out on a timely basis. Every week we actually figure out what's happening with the revenue sharing process, and there's an ongoing rolling schedule. We time every week's messages to the events that are happening that week in the administration of the program, to the deadlines. Half of the villages are assigned to receive these messages over a period of 6 months. We delivered 60 messages of the type that you saw a small sample. If you want to see all of them, they're in the appendix of our paper. The other half received villages received general public health announcements from a local hospital that's well known to be a non-governmental hospital among people in this setting. People were very enthusiastic about the platform. In the first 3 weeks of the platform, we had 202 additional requests to join the platform and only 3 requests to leave the platform. So it seems like we can rule out right away that people don't want this kind of information. And we do get a lot of face value evidence that people are concerned about the institutions as they exist, and that there are problems that we've highlighted with these revenue sharing funds, particularly around exclusion. So our thinking is, if we can provide people, well, here are the people you have to talk to in your community. Here's when the meeting is. Here are your rights to speak up in the meeting, and other things that we can actually increase efficacy within the institutions as they exist. We also have a two-way platform of communication. So our partners, the Uganda Wildlife Authority, sends out weekly micro-polls about different things. This is one of them about whether corruption is present. You can see that lots of people feel that there's corruption present in the revenue sharing. As we get to darker red, that means a greater proportion of the people who responded to text message feel that corruption is a problem. Okay, so now some results. So our basic, or let me talk a little bit about the analysis. So we're using model-assisted randomization inference, and so essentially our estimates of treatment effects are based on the design itself. We assume a sharp null, and we run lots of permutations of the randomization itself, and then we form a sampling distribution across that and look at how our actual observed differences between treated and control groups compare to the sampling distribution that we get under the design. Here's some descriptive data, and I'm not showing everything here, about some of the main measures that we use in terms of self-reported data. So we implemented a survey before assigning any of these villages or the people within them to treatment. There are about 2,000 subjects here, and we're looking then at the difference between their baseline survey responses to questions like, I know the right person to contact about revenue sharing, I have opportunities to communicate to the Uganda Wildlife Authority about revenue sharing, I participated in a revenue sharing meeting, people like me have opportunities to participate in a revenue sharing meeting, I know how revenue sharing works, I'm satisfied with the information I have. And so this is just the descriptive data with treatment group in black and the control group in the hollow dots, with the baseline measures in red for those same groups. And what we see is there's not a lot of difference between those groups that were assigned to treatment on any of these self-reported measures. If we instead look at the treatment effect in terms of the difference between end line and baseline, a kind of difference in difference approach, and we look at treatment effects, we actually see null effects across the board on all of these measures except one, which is that people who were treated with all of this information perceive fewer opportunities to participate in revenue sharing than those who were receiving these public health messages. So we see some evidence of a kind of backfire effect in this setting, which we found to be quite curious and did not predict. We've also looked at the data because of the self-report data. If you take a look at this, they're actually quite high on a lot of these scales, which indicates there might be some social desirability bias creeping in here. We have the attendance rolls of the main revenue sharing meetings in each of the villages, which is an actual observational outcome. And we're looking here at just box plots. The diamond is the mean number of adult attendees at these meetings. Black line is median. Again, we see no difference between treatment and control groups. The whiskers are the ranges here of the number of people who participated in the main meeting that's used to elect the project management committee for these, deciding on these projects. Quite to our surprise, we found that those subjects who were receiving messages from the local hospital were more likely to respond to polls that were sent out by the Uganda Wildlife Authority. So those who were receiving placebo messages about public health, and then they were asked, well, did you have the opportunity to attend your meeting this week? Do you feel that the meeting is going on in an equitable way? We find that people receiving public health messages are more likely to respond. And so we're quite puzzled by this. It seems that there's evidence of a kind of backfire effect in some of these places. When we dig into this more, and now we're below the line analyses. Everything above here was pre-registered. Now we're into exploratory mode. When we get to below the line analyses and we look at the subjects who felt disempowered at baseline, and we look at how they responded to the treatments about how you can participate in this setting, we see a more robust and more consistent backfire effect. And how we interpret this is, if you are excluded from local institutions, and somebody comes along and says, these are all the ways that you should be able to participate in local institutions, what we've essentially done is pointed out and made salient to people their exclusion from decision-making in the institutions as they exist currently, rather than overcome the institutional constraints that they face. So information perhaps is not the binding constraint, and that's what we're attempting to draw from this admittedly exploratory part of the analysis. There's one other result that I would highlight in terms of the positive treatment effect. So if we look at the survey item that says people like me have the opportunity to participate and shape revenue sharing projects in my village, if we treated a lot of people in that village, we actually see a positive effect on the extreme end, whereas if we only treated a small number of people, we don't see that positive effect. So this is perhaps suggestive of the idea that you really need to create a collective understanding about rights to participate in these local institutions. And once you have a sufficiently large coalition of people who understand their rights, then this kind of information can empower people within these existing institutions. To interpret some of these findings, we did a whole bunch of post-treatment interviews with people who were disempowered in a semi-structured way. The most common reason that the interviews came up why we don't think we had a treatment effect is that there are exclusions that are already happening in these places, and that information alone doesn't overcome the reasons for those exclusions. And there were people who said that they don't participate anymore because there's no reason to participate if I am excluded. And several people in these interviews suggested that in future years, and we have an agreement to run this experiment for a couple more cycles, so we're open to suggestions of what we do next year, is that we need some kind of institutional change in this context. Would it be possible to send an outside observer to the revenue sharing meeting, for example, to try to overcome some of the more basic institutional features that are driving exclusion in this space? So we find no discernible average treatment effect on participation, satisfaction, knowledge in this setting. We find some evidence of a backfire effect. And here, I think what we've really settled on now, especially for future years, is that information alone can be demobilizing in the face of exclusion. And we need to think of ways to overcome more fundamental constraints. We also need to find ways to treat more individuals, because there seems to be some suggestive evidence that when we treat at a higher density, we're better able to overcome these problems with exclusion. Just to cue you into the larger project, so this was the participation phase that we've presented today. We're now entering what we call the accountability phase of the project. So the projects were designed and submitted, and on April 15th of this coming month, the funds will be released to the district governments, who are then responsible for delivering the funds to the sub-county governments, who are then responsible for procuring contractors and or delivering the funds to the village governments. And as you might imagine, along the way, many of those funds are lost, as it typically works out. And so moving into the accountability phase of the project, we are now, we've moved from an SMS-based system to a voice-based system so that we can provide more specific information, and we're focused on holding district and sub-county officials accountable for actually delivering these funds. And we have planned later in the year a number of audits to see if this kind of treatment actually results in more of these projects being delivered to the places where they are planned. So it's possible that we didn't see an immediate effect of participation, but as Leonard said, maybe we need to think about less ambitious outcomes. And so maybe by getting people thinking about participation now, we'll actually see a stronger downstream effect in terms of accountability for the delivery of these projects. So thank you all, and look forward to your comments.